The morning light filtered through the tall windows of the Appalachian Heritage Museum in Asheville, casting golden streaks across rows of archived photographs and weathered documents. Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell had worked as the museum's chief curator for nearly 15 years, dedicating her life to preserving the stories of families who had built their lives in the mountain valleys of western North Carolina. Her days followed a predictable rhythm of cataloging donations, researching family lineages, and preparing exhibits that brought the past into conversation with the present. She had always believed that every photograph, every letter, every mundane household item carried within it a thread of human experience worth honoring. The museum itself occupied a restored Victorian mansion that had once belonged to the Thornton family, prominent merchants who had made their fortune in timber and textiles during the late 19th century. On this particular Tuesday in late September, Elizabeth received a large wooden crate from the estate of Margaret Thornton McClure, the last surviving descendant of the Thornton line. Margaret had passed away 3 months earlier at the age of 96, and her executors had finally completed the process of sorting through generations of family possessions stored in the attic of the old Thornton estate. The crate contained the usual assortment of items Elizabeth had come to expect from such donations: tarnished silverware, embroidered linens, a collection of leather-bound journals, and several dozen photographs in various states of preservation. Elizabeth carefully unpacked each item, making preliminary notes about condition and potential historical significance. She had learned long ago to approach such work with patience, knowing that the most valuable discoveries often emerged from the most unlikely sources. Among the photographs was a formal family portrait taken in 1898, mounted in an ornate gilded frame that had somehow survived more than a century without significant damage. The image showed the Thornton family arranged on the wide front porch of their estate. Samuel Thornton, the family patriarch, seated in the center with his wife Eleanor standing beside him, their 3 children positioned around them in descending order of age. The composition followed the conventions of the era, with everyone dressed in their finest clothes and adopting expressions of dignified solemnity. What caught Elizabeth's attention, however, was not the family members themselves, but rather a young woman standing slightly apart from the group, positioned near the edge of the frame. Unlike the Thorntons, who faced the camera directly, this woman's posture suggested a kind of reluctant participation, as though she had been included in the photograph, more as an afterthought than as an integral part of the family tableau. Elizabeth set the photograph on her desk and leaned closer, studying the young woman's features with the practiced eye of someone trained to extract information from visual evidence. She appeared to be in her early 20s, dressed in a simple dark dress that marked her clearly as household staff rather than family. Her face bore a striking beauty, despite the faded quality of the image, with high cheekbones and large eyes that seemed to hold a mixture of wariness and resignation. There was something in her expression that Elizabeth found difficult to articulate, a quality that separated her from the confident formality displayed by the Thornton family members. The longer Elizabeth looked at the photograph, the more convinced she became that there was a story here, something lurking beneath the surface of this carefully composed domestic scene that warranted further investigation. As she prepared to file the portrait with the other items for later processing, Elizabeth noticed something she had initially missed: a dark mark on the left side of the young woman's neck, partially obscured by the high collar of her dress, but still visible as a distinct irregularity in the otherwise smooth surface of the photograph. At first, she assumed it was simply damage to the image itself, perhaps a spot of mold or a chemical stain that had developed over decades of storage. But when she examined the mark more closely with a magnifying glass, she realized it was part of the original photograph, captured by the camera on that day in 1898. The mark had a defined shape, roughly circular, and appeared to be some kind of discoloration or wound on the woman's actual skin. Elizabeth felt a sudden chill run through her, an instinctive recognition that she had stumbled upon something significant, though she could not yet articulate exactly what that significance might be. Elizabeth spent the remainder of that afternoon unable to focus on her other responsibilities, repeatedly returning to the photograph and the mysterious mark on the young woman's neck. She pulled out the accompanying documents from the Thornton estate, hoping to find some reference to the household staff employed in 1898. But the materials included only family correspondence and business records that made no mention of servants by name. Victorian-era families of means typically employed several domestic workers, but these individuals rarely appeared in official family documents beyond occasional entries in household account books. Elizabeth knew from experience that recovering the stories of servants, particularly those who were young, female, or from marginalized backgrounds, required detective work that went far beyond examining the materials families chose to preserve about themselves. The historical record had been shaped by people with the power to decide whose stories mattered, and those decisions had systematically excluded the very people whose labor had made comfortable lives possible for families like the Thorntons. That evening, Elizabeth took the photograph home with her, a practice she rarely indulged in but which seemed justified by the intensity of her curiosity. She sat at her kitchen table with the image propped against a stack of books, eating a dinner she barely tasted, while her eyes kept returning to the young woman's face. There was something haunting about the photograph now, a quality that had not been apparent during her initial examination. The mark on the woman's neck seemed to pulse with unspoken meaning, a visible wound that demanded explanation. Elizabeth began to form hypotheses. Perhaps it was a birthmark, or the result of some accident or illness, or even a photographic artifact created by the development process. Yet none of these explanations satisfied her, because they failed to account for the woman's expression, which Elizabeth now read as containing not just wariness, but also a kind of muted defiance, as though she were silently challenging anyone who might look at this photograph a century later to see what had been done to her. The following morning, Elizabeth arrived at the museum 2 hours before opening time and immediately began searching through the institution's archives for any additional information about the Thornton family. She located several newspaper articles from the 1890s that chronicled the family's business ventures and social activities, but these sources treated the Thorntons as exemplary citizens whose success reflected the values of hard work and moral rectitude that were supposed to define Appalachian society. Elizabeth knew that such accounts were deeply unreliable, shaped by the class prejudices and social conventions of their era, but they at least provided context about the family's position in the community. She also found a brief mention of the Thornton estate in a local history published in the 1940s, which described the house as one of the finest examples of Victorian architecture in the region, but offered no details about the people who had actually lived and worked there beyond the family members themselves. Elizabeth's breakthrough came when she discovered a collection of census records that had been digitized by a genealogical society and made available to researchers through the museum's library system. The 1900 census, taken just 2 years after the photograph was made, listed the residents of the Thornton household, including not only family members, but also 3 domestic servants. 2 of these were identified as white women in their 40s, likely experienced housekeepers or cooks, but the 3rd was listed as a colored woman aged 21, whose occupation was given simply as maid. Her name was recorded as Harriet Mills, and the census noted that she had been born in North Carolina and was literate. Elizabeth felt a surge of excitement at this discovery, though she knew that a name alone would not be sufficient to explain the mark on Harriet's neck or to recover her full story. The census provided only the barest skeleton of information, a few data points that confirmed Harriet's existence, but revealed almost nothing about her actual experiences or the circumstances of her life. Elizabeth printed out the census record and placed it next to the photograph, comparing the date of the image with the information in the document. If the census taker had accurately recorded Harriet's age, she would have been approximately 19 years old when the portrait was taken in 1898. This matched the apparent age of the young woman in the photograph, lending credibility to the hypothesis that she and Harriet Mills were the same person. Elizabeth stared at the mark on Harriet's neck, now armed with a name, but no closer to understanding what had caused the injury or what it signified. She knew that the next phase of her investigation would require examining records that many people would prefer to keep buried, documents that revealed the violence and exploitation that had structured daily life for black women working in white households during the Jim Crow era. The mark on Harriet's neck was beginning to look less like an isolated mystery and more like visible evidence of systematic abuse, a wound that demanded not just explanation, but also acknowledgement and justice. Elizabeth spent the remainder of that afternoon unable to focus on her other responsibilities, repeatedly returning to the photograph and the mysterious mark on the young woman's neck. She pulled out the accompanying documents from the Thornton estate, hoping to find some reference to the household staff employed in 1898, but the materials included only family correspondence and business records that made no mention of servants by name. Victorian-era families of means typically employed several domestic workers, but these individuals rarely appeared in official family documents beyond occasional entries in household account books. Elizabeth knew from experience that recovering the stories of servants, particularly those who were young, female, or from marginalized backgrounds, required detective work that went far beyond examining the materials families chose to preserve about themselves. The historical record had been shaped by people with the power to decide whose stories mattered, and those decisions had systematically excluded the very people whose labor had made comfortable lives possible for families like the Thorntons. That evening, Elizabeth took the photograph home with her, a practice she rarely indulged in, but which seemed justified by the intensity of her curiosity. She sat at her kitchen table with the image propped against a stack of books, eating a dinner she barely tasted, while her eyes kept returning to the young woman's face. There was something haunting about the photograph now, a quality that had not been apparent during her initial examination. The mark on the woman's neck seemed to pulse with unspoken meaning, a visible wound that demanded explanation. Elizabeth began to form hypotheses. Perhaps it was a birthmark, or the result of some accident or illness, or even a photographic artifact created by the development process. Yet, none of these explanations satisfied her because they failed to account for the woman's expression, which Elizabeth now read as containing not just wariness but also a kind of muted defiance, as though she were silently challenging anyone who might look at this photograph a century later to see what had been done to her. The following morning, Elizabeth arrived at the museum 2 hours before opening time and immediately began searching through the institution's archives for any additional information about the Thornton family. She located several newspaper articles from the 1890s that chronicled the family's business ventures and social activities, but these sources treated the Thorntons as exemplary citizens whose success reflected the values of hard work and moral rectitude that were supposed to define Appalachian society. Elizabeth knew that such accounts were deeply unreliable, shaped by the class prejudices and social conventions of their era, but they at least provided context about the family's position in the community. She also found a brief mention of the Thornton estate in a local history published in the 1940s, which described the house as one of the finest examples of Victorian architecture in the region, but offered no details about the people who had actually lived and worked there beyond the family members themselves. Elizabeth's breakthrough came when she discovered a collection of census records that had been digitized by a genealogical society and made available to researchers through the museum's library system. The 1900 census, taken just 2 years after the photograph was made, listed the residents of the Thornton household, including not only family members, but also 3 domestic servants. 2 of these were identified as white women in their 40s, likely experienced housekeepers or cooks, but the 3rd was listed as a colored woman aged 21, whose occupation was given simply as maid. Her name was recorded as Harriet Mills, and the census noted that she had been born in North Carolina and was literate. Elizabeth felt a surge of excitement at this discovery, though she knew that a name alone would not be sufficient to explain the mark on Harriet's neck or to recover her full story. The census provided only the barest skeleton of information, a few data points that confirmed Harriet's existence, but revealed almost nothing about her actual experiences or the circumstances of her life. Elizabeth printed out the census record and placed it next to the photograph, comparing the date of the image with the information in the document. If the census taker had accurately recorded Harriet's age, she would have been approximately 19 years old when the portrait was taken in 1898. This matched the apparent age of the young woman in the photograph, lending credibility to the hypothesis that she and Harriet Mills were the same person. Elizabeth stared at the mark on Harriet's neck, now armed with a name, but no closer to understanding what had caused the injury or what it signified. She knew that the next phase of her investigation would require examining records that many people would prefer to keep buried. Documents that revealed the violence and exploitation that had structured daily life for black women working in white households during the Jim Crow era. The mark on Harriet's neck was beginning to look less like an isolated mystery and more like visible evidence of systematic abuse, a wound that demanded not just explanation, but also acknowledgement and justice. The discovery of the infirmary record transformed Elizabeth's understanding of the photograph and intensified her determination to uncover the full story of what had happened to Harriet Mills. A severe burn to the neck and shoulder was not the kind of injury that could be easily dismissed as an accident, and Harriet's initial refusal to explain how she had been burned suggested that she had been protecting someone or had feared the consequences of telling the truth. Elizabeth knew from her research into the history of domestic service that black women who worked in white households during this era had existed in a state of profound vulnerability, subject to physical and sexual violence from their employers, with virtually no legal recourse or social support. The power dynamics of the household meant that a servant who accused a white family member of abuse would almost certainly be disbelieved, fired, and possibly arrested on fabricated charges, while the accused would face no consequences whatsoever. Harriet's silence in the face of her injury was not evidence of complicity, but rather a rational response to a system designed to ensure that she could never seek justice. Elizabeth decided that she needed to learn more about the Thornton family members themselves, particularly those who had been living in the house at the time of the photograph. She returned to the census records and cross-referenced them with other sources to build profiles of each family member. Samuel Thornton, the patriarch, had been 53 years old in 1898 and was described in various business documents as a shrewd but respected figure in local commerce. His wife Eleanor had been 47 and appeared frequently in society pages as a patroness of charitable organizations and church activities. The three children ranged in age from 17 to 25. The eldest son, Richard, had been preparing to take over the family business. The daughter, Caroline, had recently returned from a finishing school in Virginia, and the youngest son, Thomas, had been studying at a military academy. On the surface, the Thorntons appeared to be exactly what they claimed to be: a successful family committed to the values of hard work, Christian virtue, and community leadership. But Elizabeth had learned to distrust such carefully constructed public images, knowing that they often concealed private cruelties that families worked hard to keep hidden from outside scrutiny. Her suspicions about the family deepened when she located a diary kept by Caroline Thornton during the years 1897 to 1899, which had been included in the materials donated to the museum, but which Elizabeth had not yet examined closely. The diary was written in a small, neat hand and consisted primarily of accounts of social visits, descriptions of dresses and parties, and expressions of religious devotion that struck Elizabeth as performative rather than sincere. But scattered throughout the diary were brief, cryptic references to household troubles and to the difficulties of managing servants who Caroline described as lazy, dishonest, or impudent. One entry from October 1898 was particularly revealing. Caroline wrote that her brother Thomas had been reprimanded by their father for his treatment of the help, and that there had been a terrible scene at dinner when Thomas had defended himself by claiming that a certain girl had encouraged his attentions. Caroline did not name the girl in question, but the timing of this entry, just a few weeks before Harriet's documented injury, suggested a troubling connection between Thomas Thornton and the burn on Harriet's neck. Elizabeth spent an entire evening reading and rereading Caroline's diary, trying to extract meaning from its deliberately vague language and its careful avoidance of anything that might reflect badly on the family's reputation. The diary painted a picture of a household in which tensions simmered beneath the surface of respectability, where servants were viewed with contempt and suspicion, and where at least one family member had behaved badly enough to warrant parental discipline. The reference to Thomas claiming that a girl had encouraged his attentions was particularly chilling, because it suggested the kind of sexual harassment or assault that black domestic workers faced constantly, but could rarely speak about openly. If Thomas had assaulted Harriet and she had resisted or threatened to report him, it was entirely plausible that he or another family member might have retaliated by inflicting the burn injury as both punishment and warning. The burn on Harriet's neck would have served as a permanent mark of her subordinate status, a visible reminder that she had no power to protect herself from the violence of her employers. Elizabeth knew that she was constructing a theory based on circumstantial evidence and that she needed more definitive proof before she could make public accusations about what had happened in the Thornton household. But the pieces were beginning to fit together in a way that felt grimly convincing. The photograph showing Harriet with a mysterious mark on her neck, the infirmary record documenting a severe burn injury, the newspaper article reporting an incident at the Thornton estate, and Caroline's diary hinting at misconduct by Thomas Thornton and subsequent family conflict. Elizabeth decided that her next step should be to search for any records related to Thomas Thornton's later life, hoping that a pattern of behavior might emerge that would corroborate her suspicions about his role in Harriet's injury. She also wanted to trace what had happened to Harriet after she left the infirmary, though she feared that the trail might have gone completely cold, leaving Harriet as yet another black woman whose suffering had been documented just enough to confirm that it had occurred, but not enough to ensure that anyone had been held accountable for causing it. Elizabeth's search for information about Thomas Thornton yielded results that both confirmed her suspicions and complicated the narrative she had been constructing. Military Academy records indicated that Thomas had been expelled in early 1899 for unspecified disciplinary violations, a significant blot on the record of a young man from a respectable family. He had subsequently worked in various capacities in the family business, but had never achieved the success of his older brother Richard, and several business associates had noted in their correspondence that Thomas was unreliable and prone to volatile behavior. Most significantly, Elizabeth discovered that Thomas had been sued in 1903 by a woman named Rebecca Hayes, who alleged that he had fathered her child and then refused to provide financial support. The case had been settled out of court, with the Thornton family paying a sum of money in exchange for Rebecca's agreement to drop the lawsuit and sign a document stating that Thomas bore no responsibility for the child. The existence of this case suggested that Thomas had a history of exploiting women with less social power than himself, and then relying on his family's wealth and influence to escape the consequences of his actions. Armed with this information, Elizabeth felt increasingly confident that Thomas Thornton had been responsible for assaulting Harriet Mills, and that the burn on her neck was connected to that assault, whether as a direct result of Thomas's violence or as punishment inflicted by other family members who wanted to silence Harriet and prevent her from damaging the family's reputation. But Elizabeth still had no direct testimony from Harriet herself, no document in which Harriet had described what had happened to her in her own words. The historical record had preserved enough traces of Harriet's existence to confirm that she had been real and that she had suffered, but it had not preserved her voice or her perspective on the events that had marked her body and shaped her life. This silence was not accidental, but rather the result of systematic efforts to ensure that people like Harriet could never tell their stories in ways that might challenge the narratives that powerful families told about themselves. Elizabeth knew that recovering Harriet's voice would require extraordinary luck, or the kind of archival discovery that happened only rarely in historical research. That extraordinary luck arrived in the form of a phone call from an elderly man named James Mills, who had seen a notice Elizabeth had posted on a genealogical website asking for information about Harriet Mills of Asheville. James explained that he was a retired teacher living in Atlanta, and that he had been researching his family history for several years. His great-grandmother had been named Harriet Mills, and according to family oral history, she had worked as a domestic servant in Asheville before moving to Atlanta around 1900. James had limited documentation about Harriet's early life, but he possessed something invaluable, a collection of letters that Harriet had written to her sister between 1898 and 1902, which had been preserved by James's grandmother and passed down through the family. James had never fully examined the letters because the handwriting was difficult to decipher, but he was willing to share them with Elizabeth if she thought they might be relevant to her research. Elizabeth could barely contain her excitement as she made arrangements to travel to Atlanta the following week to examine the letters, knowing that they might provide the breakthrough she desperately needed. The meeting with James Mills took place in his modest apartment in a quiet Atlanta neighborhood, where he welcomed Elizabeth with coffee and homemade cookies before bringing out a shoebox containing the letters. There were 37 letters in total, written on cheap paper that had yellowed and become brittle with age. The ink faded, but still legible to someone with patience and practice reading historical documents. James explained that his great-grandmother Harriet had been illiterate when she first went to work for the Thornton family, but had learned to read and write with the help of a local black teacher who ran an informal school for domestic workers. The letters were addressed to Harriet's younger sister Martha, who had remained in the rural community where the Mills family had been sharecroppers, and they documented Harriet's experiences working in Asheville and her eventual decision to leave North Carolina and start a new life in Atlanta. Elizabeth spent the entire afternoon reading through the letters, occasionally stopping to compose herself as the full horror of Harriet's story emerged from the carefully formed sentences. The letter that Elizabeth had been hoping to find was dated November 20th, 1898, just 4 days after Harriet had been admitted to the county infirmary. In it, Harriet described what had happened to her in language that was direct and unflinching despite the obvious pain she must have felt while writing. She explained that Thomas Thornton had been bothering her for months, making improper suggestions and trying to corner her in isolated parts of the house. Harriet had done her best to avoid him and had hoped that if she ignored his advances, he would eventually lose interest. But on the night of November 14th, Thomas had waited until the rest of the household was asleep and had forced his way into the small room off the kitchen where Harriet slept. When Harriet had fought him off and threatened to tell his parents what he had tried to do, Thomas had become enraged and had grabbed a fireplace poker that had been left near the stove. He had heated the poker until it glowed red and had pressed it against Harriet's neck, holding it there for several seconds while she screamed. The burn had been agonizing, and Harriet had lost consciousness from the pain. When she woke, she found that the family physician had been called and that she was being taken to the infirmary, where she was treated for the injury and kept for 3 days before being returned to the Thornton household, with stern warnings not to speak about what had happened or to cause trouble for the family. Elizabeth sat in James Mills's apartment, reading Harriet's letter over and over, trying to absorb the full weight of what had been done to this young woman and marveling at the courage it must have taken for Harriet to write down the truth, despite the danger that doing so might have placed her in. The letter made clear that Harriet understood exactly what had happened to her and who was responsible, and it provided unambiguous evidence that Thomas Thornton had assaulted her and then brutally punished her when she had dared to resist. The letter also revealed the complicity of the other Thornton family members who had chosen to protect Thomas rather than seeking justice for Harriet, and of the broader white community, which had treated Harriet's suffering as a private matter to be handled within the household, rather than as a crime requiring investigation and prosecution. Elizabeth knew that this letter would be the centerpiece of any public presentation about Harriet's story, but she also felt a profound responsibility to handle the information with care and to ensure that Harriet's testimony was presented in a way that honored her agency and her resistance, rather than reducing her to the status of a passive victim. The remaining letters in the collection documented Harriet's life after the assault and her determination to escape the Thornton household despite the limited options available to a young black woman in the Jim Crow South. Harriet had continued working for the family for another 14 months, enduring Thomas's ongoing harassment and the cold indifference of the other family members, while she saved every penny she could earn and made plans for her departure. In her letters to Martha, Harriet described the crushing loneliness of living in a house where no one acknowledged what had been done to her, and she wrote about the nightmares that plagued her sleep and the constant fear that Thomas might attack her again. But Harriet also wrote about her growing sense of determination and her conviction that she deserved better than the life she had been forced to live in Asheville. In early 1900, Harriet finally left the Thornton household and used her savings to buy a train ticket to Atlanta, where she had heard that a black woman with domestic skills could find work that paid better wages and offered more freedom than what was available in small Appalachian towns. Harriet's letters from Atlanta showed her gradual process of rebuilding her life in a new city where she could live at a distance from the people who had hurt her. She found work in a boarding house run by a black widow named Mrs. Freeman, who treated her employees fairly and paid them regular wages. Harriet rented a small room in a boarding house for black working women and began attending a Baptist church where she made friends and became involved in community activities. She also continued her education, attending night classes where she improved her reading and writing skills and learned basic mathematics and bookkeeping. The later letters revealed that Harriet eventually married a man named Robert Johnson, a railroad porter who shared her ambition to build a stable and respectable life, despite the obstacles that white supremacy placed in their path. Harriet and Robert had 4 children, and according to James, Harriet had lived to the age of 71, dying in 1948 after a long life that had been marked by both suffering and resilience. The photograph taken in 1898 had captured Harriet at the worst moment of her life, but it had not captured the fullness of who she was, or the strength she had shown in surviving and ultimately transcending the violence that had been inflicted upon her. Elizabeth returned to Asheville with copies of Harriet's letters, which James had generously agreed to donate to the museum's collection, and immediately began planning how to present this information to the public. She knew that the story would be controversial because it directly challenged the carefully curated image of the Thornton family that had been preserved in local histories and in the collective memory of Asheville's white community. The Thornton name still carried weight in the city, and there were several prominent citizens who claimed descent from the family and who would likely be disturbed by revelations about Thomas Thornton's brutality and the family's complicity in covering up his crimes. Elizabeth anticipated that some people would question the authenticity of Harriet's letters or would argue that it was inappropriate to judge historical figures by contemporary moral standards. But she also believed that museums had a responsibility to tell the truth about the past, even when that truth was uncomfortable, and that Harriet's story deserved to be known and remembered as part of the larger history of racial violence and exploitation that had shaped the American South. Elizabeth proposed a special exhibition titled A Mark That Speaks, Harriet Mills and the Hidden History of Domestic Service in Appalachia, which would center on the 1898 photograph and present Harriet's letters alongside contextual materials about the lives of black domestic workers, the prevalence of sexual violence in white households, and the mechanisms through which powerful families had silenced their victims and protected their reputations. The exhibition would also include information about Thomas Thornton's later life and the pattern of behavior that corroborated Harriet's account of what he had done to her. Elizabeth worked with the museum's education staff to develop programming that would help visitors understand the historical context of Harriet's experience and to connect that history to contemporary issues of racial justice and the ongoing struggle to center the voices of those who have been marginalized and silenced. The museum's board of directors debated the proposal for several weeks, with some members expressing concern about potential backlash from donors and community members, but ultimately they voted to approve the exhibition and to support Elizabeth in bringing Harriet's story to public attention. The exhibition opened on a cold February morning with a crowd that exceeded the museum's expectations, drawing not only the usual audience of history enthusiasts and museum regulars, but also activists, journalists, and members of Asheville's black community who had heard about Harriet's story through social media and word of mouth. Elizabeth had arranged for James Mills to attend the opening, and he stood beside her as they prepared to unveil the photograph and the accompanying materials to the public for the first time. The centerpiece of the exhibition was the 1898 portrait, which had been professionally restored and mounted in a prominent position, with Harriet's face and the mark on her neck clearly visible. Beside the photograph was a timeline documenting what Elizabeth had been able to piece together about Harriet's life, from her birth in rural North Carolina, through her time in the Thornton household, her escape to Atlanta, and her later years as a wife, mother, and working woman. The exhibition also included enlarged copies of several of Harriet's letters, with transcriptions provided to help visitors read the faded handwriting, and a section exploring the broader history of violence against black domestic workers in the post-Reconstruction South. The response to the exhibition was immediate and polarized in ways that Elizabeth had anticipated, but that were nonetheless difficult to navigate. Members of Asheville's black community expressed gratitude that Harriet's story was finally being told, and that the museum was acknowledging the violence that had been such a pervasive feature of black women's lives during the Jim Crow era. Several visitors shared their own family stories of ancestors who had worked in white households and had experienced similar forms of exploitation and abuse. And these testimonies added layers of meaning to Harriet's individual experience by showing how common such suffering had been. But the exhibition also generated backlash from some white residents who viewed it as an unfair attack on a respected local family and who questioned whether it was appropriate for a museum to present allegations about long-dead individuals who could not defend themselves. Two descendants of the Thornton family wrote letters to the local newspaper arguing that the exhibition was based on unreliable evidence and that it ignored the charitable activities and community contributions that the Thornton family had made over many generations. Elizabeth found herself at the center of a public controversy that extended far beyond the usual quiet debates of academic historical research. She gave interviews to local and regional media outlets, appeared on a podcast about Southern history, and participated in a panel discussion at the museum about how cultural institutions should handle difficult histories that implicate prominent families and challenge dominant narratives. In each of these venues, Elizabeth made the case that Harriet's letters provided credible first-person testimony about what had happened to her, and that the corroborating evidence from census records, newspaper articles, the infirmary log, and Caroline Thornton's diary created a strong foundation for concluding that Harriet had told the truth about being assaulted and burned by Thomas Thornton. Elizabeth also argued that the discomfort some people felt about the exhibition was precisely the point. Confronting the reality of racial violence required acknowledging that such violence had been perpetrated not by anonymous villains, but by real people who had been respected members of their communities and whose descendants continued to benefit from the wealth and status their families had accumulated through exploitation. The controversy reached its peak when a group calling itself the Friends of Appalachian Heritage organized a protest outside the museum, arguing that the exhibition promoted divisiveness and failed to present a balanced view of the Thornton family's legacy. The protest drew about 30 people, mostly older white residents, who carried signs reading, "Innocent until proven guilty and stop attacking our history." Elizabeth and the museum's director decided not to engage directly with the protesters, but instead issued a statement reiterating the museum's commitment to historical accuracy and to amplifying voices that had been systematically excluded from traditional historical narratives. The statement noted that presenting uncomfortable truths about the past was not an attack on heritage, but rather an essential part of understanding how historical injustices continued to shape contemporary society. The protest received media coverage that actually increased attendance at the exhibition, as people who might not otherwise have visited the museum came to see what all the controversy was about and to form their own judgments about Harriet's story. As the weeks passed and the initial intensity of the controversy began to fade, Elizabeth noticed that the tone of public discussion was starting to shift in subtle but significant ways. Some of the people who had initially defended the Thornton family began to acknowledge that the evidence presented in the exhibition was more substantial than they had assumed, and that Harriet's account deserved serious consideration. Several local historians reached out to Elizabeth to share their own research about other cases of violence against black domestic workers in the region, suggesting that Harriet's experience had been part of a much larger pattern that had never been adequately documented or addressed. A group of students from a nearby college organized a project to research the lives of other black women who had worked in white Asheville households during the same era, hoping to recover more stories that had been buried or forgotten. Elizabeth began to feel that despite the difficulties and the backlash, the exhibition had succeeded in opening up a conversation about historical truth and racial justice that the community needed to have, even if not everyone was ready to accept the implications of that conversation. 3 months after the exhibition opened, Elizabeth received an unexpected visit from a woman named Patricia Thornton Edwards, who introduced herself as a great-great-granddaughter of Samuel and Eleanor Thornton and a direct descendant of Caroline Thornton. Patricia was in her late 60s, elegantly dressed and clearly uncomfortable, as she explained that she had waited several weeks before deciding to come to the museum because she had not been sure how to respond to the exhibition about Harriet Mills. She had initially been among those who felt that the exhibition was unfair to her family, and she had signed one of the letters to the newspaper questioning the reliability of Harriet's testimony. But Patricia explained that the exhibition had prompted her to search through materials that had been stored in her own attic, items that had been passed down through Caroline's branch of the family, but which Patricia had never examined closely. Among these materials, Patricia had found another diary kept by Caroline Thornton, this one covering the years 1899 to 1901, which contained entries that corroborated and expanded upon what Elizabeth had uncovered about Thomas Thornton and about what had happened to Harriet Mills. Elizabeth invited Patricia into her office, where they sat together, examining the newly discovered diary, as Patricia explained what had led her to bring it to the museum. Patricia said that she had spent sleepless nights thinking about the exhibition and about what it might mean if Harriet's account was true, and she had realized that her attachment to a sanitized version of her family's history had been preventing her from seeing the evidence that had been there all along. The diary she had found included an entry from December 1898 in which Caroline wrote explicitly about the incident with Thomas and Harriet, describing how her brother had burned the maid with a fireplace poker after she had rejected his advances and threatened to tell their father about his behavior. Caroline's entry revealed that she had been horrified by what Thomas had done, but had felt powerless to intervene because her father had decided that the family's reputation was more important than seeking justice for a servant. Caroline wrote that she had nightmares about Harriet's screams and that she felt profound guilt about her own silence, but she had convinced herself that there was nothing she could have done to change the situation or to help Harriet in any meaningful way. Patricia's decision to share this diary was an act of considerable courage, because it meant publicly acknowledging that her ancestor had been complicit in covering up a violent crime, and that the Thornton family's respected legacy was built in part on their willingness to sacrifice the well-being of a vulnerable young woman to protect one of their own. Elizabeth thanked Patricia for her honesty and her willingness to contribute to a fuller understanding of what had happened, and she proposed incorporating Caroline's second diary into the exhibition with appropriate context, explaining how it had come to light. Patricia agreed, and she also offered to write a statement for the exhibition in which she acknowledged the harm that Thomas Thornton had inflicted on Harriet Mills and expressed regret that her family had not been held accountable at the time. Patricia's statement noted that confronting difficult truths about one's ancestors was painful but necessary, and she encouraged other families to examine their own histories with similar honesty, rather than clinging to myths that obscured the realities of racial violence and exploitation. The addition of Caroline's diary and Patricia's statement transformed the public conversation about the exhibition in ways that Elizabeth had not anticipated. The fact that a descendant of the Thornton family was now acknowledging the truth of Harriet's testimony and expressing remorse for what had happened gave the story a dimension of reconciliation and moral accountability that resonated with many visitors. Several other families with connections to prominent 19th century households began to examine their own archives and to ask questions about the treatment of black domestic workers in their ancestors' homes. The museum organized a series of public programs exploring how contemporary descendants of both victims and perpetrators of historical injustice could work together to acknowledge the past and to address its ongoing legacies. These programs drew diverse audiences and generated thoughtful discussions about memory, responsibility, and the possibility of building more honest and equitable communities by facing rather than hiding from uncomfortable historical truths. Elizabeth also worked with James Mills and with Patricia Thornton Edwards to create an educational resource based on Harriet's story that could be used in schools throughout the region. The resource included excerpts from Harriet's letters, contextual materials about the history of domestic service and racial violence, and discussion questions designed to help students think critically about how historical narratives are constructed and whose voices are included or excluded from those narratives. The resource was piloted in several high schools, where teachers reported that students were deeply engaged by Harriet's story and by the questions it raised about justice, power, and the obligations that living people have to those who came before them. One teacher noted that her students had been particularly struck by the fact that Harriet had survived and had gone on to build a life for herself in Atlanta, and that this aspect of the story had helped them see resilience and agency even in contexts of extreme oppression. Elizabeth hoped that by teaching young people about Harriet's experience, the museum could contribute to a generation that would be better equipped to recognize and challenge injustice in their own time. As the exhibition entered its 6th month, Elizabeth reflected on how much had changed since that September morning, when she had first noticed the mark on Harriet Mills's neck in the 1898 photograph. What had begun as a curator's curiosity about a mysterious detail in an old portrait had evolved into a major historical recovery project that had exposed long-buried truths about racial violence, challenged a community to reckon with its past, and ultimately created new possibilities for dialogue and understanding across lines of race and family heritage. The photograph itself had become iconic, reproduced in newspapers and academic journals, and featured in discussions about how museums could use their collections to address difficult histories. But for Elizabeth, the most meaningful outcome was the fact that Harriet Mills was no longer an anonymous figure whose suffering had been rendered invisible by the structures of power that had governed her world. Harriet now had a name, a story, and a place in the historical record that acknowledged both what had been done to her and how she had responded to that injustice with courage and determination. The museum's attendance had increased significantly as a result of the exhibition, and the institution had received several grants to expand its work on recovering the histories of Black domestic workers and other marginalized groups whose experiences had been excluded from traditional narratives about Appalachian life. Elizabeth hired 2 additional researchers to help with this expanded mission, and together they began identifying other photographs in the museum's collection that might contain similarly hidden stories. One of these researchers, a young black woman named Keisha Thompson, who had grown up in Asheville, brought a perspective and set of questions that enriched the work in ways that Elizabeth found both humbling and inspiring. Keisha pointed out that recovering stories like Harriet's was only the first step, and that museums also needed to think carefully about how they presented such stories to ensure that they did not simply reproduce voyeuristic narratives of Black suffering, but instead centered Black resistance, survival, and community building. This feedback prompted Elizabeth to revisit some of the interpretive materials in the exhibition and to make changes that better reflected the fullness of Harriet's life, rather than reducing her to the moment of her victimization. The museum also established a community advisory board that included descendants of Black domestic workers, scholars of African American history, and community activists who could provide guidance on how to approach sensitive historical topics in ways that served the interests of the communities most affected by those histories. The board met quarterly to review proposed exhibitions and programs, and their input helped the museum avoid some of the pitfalls that cultural institutions often encountered when they attempted to address historical injustice without meaningful engagement with the descendants of those who had been harmed. Elizabeth found that working with the advisory board deepened her understanding of her own role as a white curator handling materials related to Black history, and she became more conscious of the ways that her own assumptions and blind spots could shape how stories were told. The process was sometimes uncomfortable, but Elizabeth came to see that discomfort as a necessary part of doing ethical and responsible historical work. One of the most moving moments of the entire project came when James Mills returned to Asheville for a special program marking the 1-year anniversary of the exhibition's opening. James brought several members of his extended family, including his mother, who was Harriet's granddaughter, and who was making her first visit to the city where her grandmother had endured so much suffering. At a reception following the program, James's mother stood in front of the photograph of Harriet and wept, saying that she had heard stories about her grandmother's strength and resilience, but had never fully understood what Harriet had survived until seeing the exhibition and reading the letters that documented her experience. She thanked Elizabeth and the museum staff for honoring Harriet's memory and for ensuring that her story would not be forgotten. She also spoke about how knowing the full truth about Harriet's life had helped her make sense of certain family patterns and intergenerational trauma that she had observed but had never been able to explain. The experience of witnessing James's mother's emotional response to seeing her grandmother's image and story, presented with dignity and respect, reminded Elizabeth of why this work mattered and why it was worth enduring controversy and criticism to tell the truth about the past. The museum also partnered with a local filmmaker to produce a short documentary about Harriet's story and about the process of researching and presenting the exhibition. The documentary included interviews with Elizabeth, James Mills, Patricia Thornton Edwards, and several scholars who provided context about the history of domestic service and racial violence in the South. It also featured footage of visitors viewing the exhibition and reacting to Harriet's photograph and letters, capturing the range of emotions that the story evoked. The documentary was screened at several film festivals and was eventually picked up by a streaming service that made it available to a national audience. The wider distribution of Harriet's story led to additional media attention and to invitations for Elizabeth to speak at conferences and universities about the methodology she had used to recover Harriet's history from fragmentary and incomplete records. Elizabeth was grateful for these opportunities, but always insisted that the focus should remain on Harriet herself, rather than on the detective work that had gone into uncovering her story. And she made sure to always acknowledge the contributions of James Mills, whose decision to share his family's letters had made everything else possible. 2 years after the exhibition first opened, Elizabeth received notification that the Appalachian Heritage Museum had been awarded a major grant from a national foundation to create a permanent gallery dedicated to the histories of Black domestic workers in the South. The grant was explicitly inspired by the success of the Harriet Mills exhibition and by the museum's demonstrated commitment to recovering and presenting marginalized histories in ways that challenged dominant narratives and centered the voices of those who had been historically silenced. Elizabeth was named as the lead curator for the new gallery, which would feature not only Harriet's story, but also the stories of dozens of other Black women whose labor had sustained white households and whose experiences had been systematically excluded from historical memory. The gallery would include interactive elements that allowed visitors to explore primary source documents, listen to oral histories recorded by descendants of domestic workers, and engage with scholarship about the economics and politics of domestic service. It would also include a space for temporary exhibitions that could highlight new research and emerging stories as they were uncovered. The planning process for the new gallery brought together historians, museum professionals, artists, and community members in a collaborative effort to create something that would be both historically rigorous and emotionally resonant. Elizabeth worked closely with Keisha Thompson and with members of the Community Advisory Board to ensure that the gallery did not simply present a catalogue of horrors, but instead showed the complex ways that Black domestic workers had navigated systems of oppression, built communities of mutual support, and resisted exploitation in both overt and subtle ways. The gallery would acknowledge the violence and indignity that characterize so much of domestic work, while also celebrating the intelligence, creativity, and resilience of the women who had performed that work. It would feature photographs, letters, account books, and other documents that revealed the daily realities of domestic labor, and it would include contemporary art pieces that reflected on the legacy of that history and its connections to present-day issues of labor exploitation and racial inequality. The permanent gallery opened 3 years to the day after Elizabeth had first noticed the mark on Harriet Mills's neck in the 1898 photograph. The opening ceremony was attended by descendants of dozens of families whose ancestors' stories were featured in the gallery, by scholars and students who had contributed research to the project, and by community members who had supported the museum's efforts to tell more complete and honest histories. James Mills gave a speech in which he reflected on how discovering Harriet's letters had changed his understanding of his own family and had connected him to a community of people engaged in similar work of historical recovery and truth-telling. Patricia Thornton Edwards also spoke, describing her journey from defensiveness to acceptance and her conviction that white descendants of families implicated in racial violence had a responsibility to acknowledge that history and to work toward repair and reconciliation. The ceremony concluded with a moment of silence in honor of all the black domestic workers whose names and stories had been lost to history, followed by a reading of Harriet's letter describing what Thomas Thornton had done to her and her determination to survive and build a better life. In the months and years that followed, the gallery became one of the museum's most visited and most impactful exhibitions, drawing school groups, tourists, and researchers from across the country and around the world. It generated ongoing media coverage and became a model for how museums could approach difficult histories in ways that were both unflinching and humane. Elizabeth continued to receive messages from visitors who had been moved by Harriet's story and who had been inspired to research their own family histories or to engage in activism aimed at addressing contemporary forms of labor exploitation and racial injustice. Several universities incorporated the gallery into their curricula, using it as a case study in public history and as an example of how institutions could work with communities to create more inclusive and accurate narratives about the past. The photograph of Harriet Mills, with the mark clearly visible on her neck, became an enduring symbol of both the violence that had marked black women's lives under slavery and Jim Crow, and the strength that had allowed those women to survive and to pass on legacies of resistance to future generations. Elizabeth often thought about the chain of events that had led from a moment of curatorial curiosity to a major institutional transformation and to the recovery of a story that might otherwise have remained buried forever. She thought about how easily Harriet's photograph could have been filed away without a second glance, how the letters might have been thrown out by descendants who did not understand their significance, how Caroline's diary might have remained hidden in an attic indefinitely. The fragility of historical memory troubled her, but so did the recognition that even fragmentary evidence could be pieced together to recover meaningful truths when researchers were willing to ask difficult questions and to follow the evidence wherever it led. Elizabeth hoped that the work she and her colleagues had done would inspire others to look more carefully at the photographs, documents, and objects in their own collections, and to recognize that every artifact potentially contained stories that had been suppressed or forgotten and that deserved to be brought back into the light. The mark on Harriet Mills's neck had been intended as a symbol of her powerlessness, a permanent reminder that she could be hurt with impunity by those who held authority over her. But in the end, that mark had become something different, evidence that demanded accountability, testimony that could not be silenced even across more than a century, and a starting point for a process of truth-telling and historical reckoning that had rippled outward in ways that no one could have predicted. Harriet had survived the violence inflicted upon her, had built a life and a family, and had left behind letters that ensured her voice would eventually be heard. Her story had become part of the larger story of how communities could choose to confront their pasts honestly rather than clinging to comforting myths, and how that confrontation, painful as it was, could open up possibilities for greater understanding, justice, and healing. The 1898 photograph still hung in the museum, but it no longer showed simply a peaceful family portrait. It now showed Harriet Mills, a woman whose suffering had been documented, but whose strength and dignity had ultimately proven more enduring than the violence that had tried to erase her.